Okay, so this is our second week reading Simondon's text, Form, Information, Potentials, in particular the discussion portion. So we read the summary and then the first half of the discussion, and now we're reading the second half. So we got to the intervention of Gabriel Marcel, who for some reason introduced Herbart, who was a 19th century German philosopher. He sort of had a certain influence on education theory, as far as I know, but has mostly been forgotten. The little that I've read of his suggests that might not be an accident that he has been forgotten. Anyway, so Marcel brings up Herbart for an unknown reason, because he doesn't know anything about Herbart either. And Simondon says that he doesn't know anything about it. So the issue that Marcel brought up was whether Simondon's exposition requires an ontology, whether he has to have a sort of a preliminary ontology in order to fit in the concepts that he's presenting. And Simondon rejects that idea. He says we don't, he actually thinks that an ontology in this case is not possible. So because in the sphere of the human, there's no sort of elemental, there's no elements or atoms or something like that. There's no smallest component out of which everything else is built up, and there's no totality. There's no group of all groups in the realm of the human. And so for that reason, we can only ever have somewhere an intermediate science or discourse. It can only be in the realm of the intermediate rather than the atomic or the totality. So we're always in the realm of the psychosocial rather than the psychology in the strict sense or sociology in the strict sense. And so that's sort of where we got up to. We're still looking at this interaction between Marcel and Simondon. So we can continue from there.
That was a good explanation. Thank you.
Right. So I think where we got to was on near the bottom of page 4, where Marcel asks, or he starts saying, "I'm not saying that it is." I think that was where we got to. So I'll start from there. What we started doing last week, which was kind of fun, was to have one person read one intervention and then have someone else read the response. So if someone else would like to take on the Simondon parts, I'll read the Marcel parts and someone else can read Simondon. Right, so Marcel says, "I'm not saying that it is, so I'm not saying that an anthropology is possible. But I have the impression that if you do not pose it as a prerequisite, then all that you say, I mean the passages that you operate from one order to another, for example, if you will, from the psychological order to the sociological order, appears arbitrary and questionable. That's just what I meant. Once again, it seems to me, on the other hand, extremely attractive and very interesting."
We are in the middle term. We are at the level of correlations. It is a pure psychosociology, one could say. I tried to say that there was no pure psychology, but the one was always, even when one studies the individual, and even when one studies the group, at the level of a psychosociology, that is to say, a study of the domains.
Yes, but this psychosociology, in spite of everything, you suspend on a physics, to the extent that you have introduced, for example, at a given moment, the idea of a difference in potential, which has all the same an extremely precise sense for a physicist. But from the moment you apply it to the psychosociological field, it still seems to me, to be questionable.
Yes, but it is an application of a paradigmatic thought. I am not the first to do it.
I would like to know what the philosophy of the paradigm is for you.
I think I legitimize the analogy. I think I legitimize the paradigmatism. and I believe I have legitimized the use of an analogy by the notion of transduction. There is somehow identity between the method I use, which is an analogical method, and the ontology that I suppose, which is an ontology of the transduction, of the transductive operation in taking shape. If the transductive operation of the form taking does not exist, the analogy is an invalid logical process. It is a postulate. The postulate is both ontological and methodological here.
Right. So we'll stop there for now. So that's the sort of the intervention or the exchange with Marcel ends there. That last paragraph from Simondon is very important. So this is a key notion for him. The way that the transductive operation corresponds to the analogical thinking, or he puts it in the individuation book. He says that transduction is what is valid about analogical thinking. We also saw in the mode of existence of technical objects, the book that we just finished reading a couple weeks ago. He explains analogical thinking or analogy as having to do with the relation between figure and ground within an entity. So within each entity, there's a figure and ground elements or aspects. There's something pre-individual that remains within an individuated being. So that's the ground aspect. And then there's the individuated result of that process of individuation, which is the figure aspect. And then the analogical relationship is a relation between those relations. So the relation between figure and ground in one entity and the relation between figure and ground in another entity are themselves related, and that relation is the analogy. And so, as he points out in this paragraph, this postulate of transductive thinking or the transductive operation is both ontological and methodological. So it's at the same time he's postulating that this operation is something that characterizes the genesis of entities, and is also what governs the method of thinking, because as he also explains in a couple places, our knowledge of transduction is brought about by performing a transductive operation within knowledge. So the actual operation of thinking through which we come to know transductive operations is itself transductive. So that's why this postulate has to be both ontological and methodological at the same time.
Sorry, folks, it's been a while since I've been around, but I'm excited to get back into Simondon. I was just to clarify that. So I was just trying to read a little bit of some other stuff from like the foreword and some other text. What you're saying about the methodological and the analogical, does that have to do as well with his concept of information? And I can't remember which essay I was reading, but it was talking about how in like the mistaken view for him, or like the traditional philosophical view is a view of, if you even want to call it information, but one in which like the information is lost in the procedure as it's sort of translated into the new thing. But the point for him is in the transductive, like it's not, I think the phrase he uses, like it's not equal, or it's not able to be like reciprocated across the equation, like it just goes back to what it was. You can't just keep translating things into each other endlessly, but that whatever the starting term or the starting content, the informational thing is like the seed that is like the crystal or whatever. I might be mixing things here. I'm just trying to understand if that is related to his point about the methodological.
Yeah, I think the idea that you're getting at there is so in this text itself, in the form, information, and potentials, in the lecture itself that we didn't read, but also in the summary part that we did read, he he characterizes the traditional notion of information, so the notion from information theory, as a reciprocal relation. So it's in the sense that the receiver and transmitter are reversible. They operate on the same code, and the actual transmission of information can be reversed. So on this form of information, there's actually information can only ever be lost on this account in the transmission. It can only transmit accurately, in which case you have zero loss, or you can have degradation through the introduction of noise, and then you lose information. But what Simondon wants to account for with his notion of information, his modified notion, is for the creation of information. So how exactly is the information created in the first place that can secondarily be transmitted? So this notion of transduction is supposed to account for the creation of information. So it's through the structuring of this pre-individuated field that information comes about, or that the field comes to be structured. So yes, I do think it is related in the sense that this notion of transduction is supposed to account for how information is generated in the first place before transmission. So yeah, those two themes are related. So are there any other questions or comments before we go on to the next sort of interaction within the dialogue?
Yeah, maybe a brief take, if somebody can talk a little bit about the crystallization, just as a kind of review, if that's relevant. The transduction.
Right. Yeah, we did talk about this a bit last week, but because we didn't read the lecture itself, we didn't have like the sort of detailed analysis of this, and we'll see this pretty soon in the individuation book. It's in chapter 1, I believe. So in a couple of weeks, once we get through the introduction, we should get to that. But the general idea is that he takes the formation of crystals as a model for how this transductive process occurs in general. So in formation of crystals, you have a supersaturated solution, which is unstructured. It doesn't have any it doesn't have a crystal structure already. And then a germ, a tiny piece of crystal, is introduced into the solution. And then the solution starts to crystallize around the germ. So the transductive operation occurs at the limit of the crystal already formed, the germ, and then the slowly forming crystal. So the operation occurs always at the limit of the already structured and the unstructured. And so the transductive operation is how the solution takes on structure. And so this crystallization, he uses this as the model for transductive operations in other realms as well. So we'll see in the individuation book that he relates this to the formation of living beings as well. As we discussed a little bit today, that the intellectual operation of analogy is also a model of transduction. So it's taking the example of the crystallization and using it as a model for other types of operations.
It sounds like it's coming from kind of a material science understanding, a little bit, physico, chemical.
Yeah, so he's drawing these notions from physics as he says in this dialogue here, as paradigms, that can be applied to other domains. And in the individuation book, he starts from physical individuation. He first looks at the example of a brick being formed, and why that example is in some ways misleading. As we saw in the end of the conclusion of the on-motive existence of technical objects, the brick example can be misleading because it leads to a hylomorphic schema, so a schema in which form and matter interact. Again, we'll see the more detailed his criticisms of that notion. But then he goes on to the formation of the crystal, which he takes to be the more the better example to use as a form of individuation of physical objects. And then he goes on to living beings and psychic individuation and psychosocial individuation in the second part of the book. But we'll get to that probably in a few months because it'll take a while to get there. But so it's drawing from these paradigms in the physical sciences and applying them to other domains as well. And I should also mention, if anyone wants to post questions or comments or anything in the chat, they can do that as well. And you can either go on the mic and ask a question or post it in the chat, and or if you have any comments on what we're reading as well, and we can try to answer the questions and address the comments. But if there's nothing else for this section, I think we can go on to the next exchange between Simondon and Duguay. So can I get 2 volunteers to read the exchange?
So here's Daniel Duguay. I can tell you that I was very interested in the whole axiomatic aspect of your presentation, and I would like to point out that at the statistics seminar of the Faculty of Science, we deal with questions of this kind. There appears to be an axiomatic structure in mathematics at the present time that could encompass the theory of opinion, the theory of the lifespan of organisms, certain theories of resistance of materials, such as the theory of wear of mechanical parts. This axiomatic structure is that of the largest or weakest values. The resistance of a chain is, as everyone knows, that of the weakest link. In the same way, the opinion of a group, which earlier caught your attention, is the opinion of one person, the one whose social data, either his position or his moral influence, allow him to radiate his opinion.
It's the leader.
Yes, just as the weakest link in a chain besides its own existence has a collective existence that characterizes the resistance of the chain, so the personal opinion of the leader is an exhaustive summary. It is the term we use in statistics of the opinion of the group it controls. In my opinion, it is wrong to see in public opinion a phenomenon of average. It is, on the contrary, a phenomenon of extreme values, always in the statistical sense of the term. Physiology makes it possible to pose certain problems which have a similar axiomatic structure. The life of an organism is the life of the most fragile organ. It would certainly be very interesting to study from this point of view the mortality curves of the different species. How is it that the life of a human organism is about 80 years old, that of a dog of 15, that of a cat of 18 to 19, that of a horse about 40 years old? All these things have never been explained, and I think they relate in an axiomatic that would be the one of the greatest value.
Yes, but the axiomatic of the greatest value could then have some analogies with the theory of transductivity. Because if a chain has the resistance of its weakest link, it is because there is a transfer, it might be said, coupling from one link to the other.
Certainly.
Just as a wall is able to support the weight that its worst built base is able to support, because it is a system of vertical transfer of forces, we would end up with a theory analogous to the Cartesian doctrine here, that of the transfer.
The link does not have a proper existence, it has a collective existence. The weakest link is a link, but at the same time the whole chain.
Because there is concatenation, because you're dealing with a transductive structure.
Right, so we can pause there. So thank you for that little reenactment for us. So some of this is a little bit, I would say, compressed. So there's a sort of brief mention or allusion to the Cartesian doctrine that Simondon makes, and we saw this a few months ago actually when we read I can't remember the title of the text right now, but he talks about the Cartesian model of reasoning as being a chain of reasons. So there's you start from something fundamental, something that is absolutely certain, like the cogito, and then you transmit certainty along the chain of reasons, and each link has to transmit the certainty to the next one, and the whole chain will be a strong chain. You'll have a certain sequence of reasonings if as long as each link transmits the certainty to the next one. So that's the Cartesian doctrine that he refers to in passing in this exchange here. So in modeling the reasoning process on the transmission of force across a chain.
I don't have anything to say on this one, but could I be record for this next part?
Sure. Before we get to that, though, I just wanted to maybe talk a little bit about Duguay's intervention, because, yeah, I'm not sure exactly what he's referring to when he talks about this axiomatic within the realm of statistics. But I think the idea or the sort of general approach that Duguay is finding in common between what he's doing in the statistical realm and what Simondon is doing in philosophy is that paradigmatism that Simondon mentioned in the previous exchange. So in the way that Simondon draws a paradigm from one realm and applies it to a different realm, so like a physical process is taken as a model for an intellectual process, for example. In the same way, in statistics, you can create a statistical model that is maybe drawn from mortality statistics and lifespan statistics, and apply that same type of model to public opinion. So it's that paradigmatism, I think, is what Duguay is identifying as common to what he does and what Simondon is doing.
Duguay is he like a biochemist, or? I couldn't find much information about him on interwebs.
Yeah, I actually don't know him at all. I'm not sure. I mean, he talks about working in the statistics department, so I would guess he must be a mathematician or something along those lines, but I'm not sure.
I was thinking about, I guess, the difference between the averages and the maximum, or what did he call the extreme values. I think if you're just taking if you're mapping from some sample set to like the reals or something like that, then you could kind of take the average or kind of the maximum of that, I guess. And I think that's kind of the statistical sense of the difference between the average and the maximum value. So you would get the highest representative, well, the highest value in the sample set would be the resultant value, or the lowest. Those would be the extreme values, I suppose. I don't know. I'm not a statistics studier, but I think that's probably sufficient to understand kind of the statistical sense in which he's trying to get that across, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, just quickly, I was kind of thinking that too, that the mean and the minimum and the maximum were sort of axiomatic for statistics.
And in this sense, I find it very interesting that he's contrasting here this notion of the average in certain systems, maybe in opinion sense, like in social psychology or in an organism, and this notion of the extreme of a minimum and a maximum. As he said, the weakest part of a chain defines the chain. So in this sense, when we look, for example, at an organism, we don't have to assume that there's an average form of interaction between all these parts, because this would say not very much about an organism, as well as the average of income of all the population doesn't say a lot about the social structure, because you have to look at the median and at the extremes. How much are these varying, the extreme highs and the extreme lows? And in this sense, when we are looking at extremes, like in the minimum as well as in the maximum, there comes in a form of dynamic, for example, in organisms, because as there was said, around this weakest points in an organism, the rest of the organism has to compensate this in a certain sense, not to average it out, but to structure it in this way that the interconnectedness is supported even in the future, and not that the weakest point is falling off or is risking the whole structure in itself. So there has to be a constant evolution about these different extremes, so they support each other.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think it's a good point to tie this notion of extremes, minimum and maximum, to dynamics, because I think it helps to make sense of that maybe a little bit obscure remark where he says that we should think of public opinion as a phenomenon of extreme values rather than as a phenomenon of the average. And this is like, there's a sort of commonplace idea of public opinion as having to do with the average opinion, and you have opinion polling and saying the average American believes X, Y, and Z, or the average German or whatever, this notion that there's the extreme. The extreme is where public opinion is sort of centered, I think, or maybe not centered, but the extreme values are what characterize public opinion already. Brings with it this notion that there's a sort of structuring of the domain on the basis of these extreme values, that somehow there's a transmission from these extreme values into the rest of the domain of public opinion.
Yeah, I think that this becomes interesting in kind of the kind of conceptual, the kind of a potential for a genetic kind of account for our account for conceptual genesis, I suppose. Because if it is true that there are certain manifest aspects of the way that we think of, that we conceptualize things, the way we name things, etc., that relate to these maximas and minimas rather than averages, then there's a certain kind of emphatic difference, I guess, where there could be kind of like an asymptotic nonlinear relation between motivations, if you were to map them out, where people begin to get very, very tense. There's like an increase in tension as you approach the boundary of that minima or maxima, possibly. I'm just kind of thinking of implications more broadly than I should be, possibly, but.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting comparison, because in the lecture itself, he does talk about pre-revolutionary situations. A situation in which the social group is sort of destructures itself before a restructuring. So he compares this to in the development of a child. The child, for example, starts crawling, and then they sort of become proficient at crawling. They can get around easily, but then at some point the crawling mechanism starts to become destructured. They sort of lose their proficiency, and then it restructures in a new form where they can start walking on two legs. So I'm oversimplifying it, but there's a destructuring of the mechanism and then a restructuring. And he compares this to the revolutionary situation or the pre-revolutionary situation, where there's a sort of destructuring of the social field that's preliminary to a restructuring of it. And so I wonder if we can compare this to these phenomena of minimum and maximum that he's that Duguay is bringing up here. That there would be some sort of a maximum state that can, like a maximum of tension or something like that, that would precede a restructuring, and a new average would come about as a result of this maximum or something like that. I'm not sure if that is a valid comparison to make, but yeah, it's an interesting connection.
Yeah, I think we're probably not allowed to do like make inference from statistical dynamics without like sufficient formal. Like we need to use like 500 symbols to do this. So we can't just use words. We're not allowed to do that.
Yeah, statistics is hard, and I know very little about statistics, so I can't comment too much about what Duguay is bringing to this intervention, but I'm just going on the basis of his remarks and how he presents it. But I'm sure there's much more technical ways of discussing these topics. Maybe just I'll bring up what Alyosha put in the chat here, that this can be connected to stable and metastable equilibrium. Yeah, I think that's probably a useful comparison. So there's so this notion of metastability is a key one for Simondon. So it's a sort of provisional stability in which there's still potential for transformation, as opposed to stability in the sense of the lowest energy state, or the state after which the transformation has already occurred. So a metastable state is not undergoing a transformation, but it retains the potential for transformation. So something like the statistical average would be, I guess, something that it has this appearance of stability, but the introduction of new extreme value can restructure the whole social field of public opinion. And yeah, so we can draw this connection with metastability. I think that's a useful connection to make.
I can do it.
I'm starting to record. Y'all ready? I would like to point out a preliminary difficulty. I do not mean that there is no answer to this difficulty, but I would like to hear it. This difficulty is this: can we attempt an axiomatization of the human sciences from a domain that does not itself belong to the human sciences? More precisely, what seems to me to be anterior to the human sciences is not nature, but the totality of man plus nature. Can we, from a structure of thought borrowed from nature, axiomatize the whole man plus nature? It seems to me that one is necessarily condemned to something like a paralogism whenever one tries to explain the totality by the laws of one of its parts. Thus, as soon as you have explained the origin of the Platonic archetype by the model of the striking of metal, you have been obliged to say that the relation of the wedge to the metal was the model of the relation of the idea to the sensible. The notion of model in this proposition does not itself model the relation of the wedge to the metal. It belongs by right to the world of discourse, and is constituted from the relation of sense to appearance. How can you, without paralogism, constitute a structure of language from the things spoken of in language? How can a relationship between things, the corner and the metal, serve as a model for the meaning of speech? If one really wants to axiomatize the sciences of man, it seems to me more coherent to do so from the most significant discourse, that which tends towards the totality and not from an object sector of the speech. There are, moreover, other possibilities of axiomatization than that which would proceed from the top downwards from the total discourse, perhaps from the nascent pre-categorical signification. On the other hand, I do not see how we can constitute the universe of discourse from the region nature, which is itself something in the discourse.
No. If we admit that the region nature is part of the discourse, we cannot. that there is a possibility.
The speech cannot be part of one of its object sectors. In Stoic language, what is said is not a body. I cannot understand what is said by means of what is said.
The speech cannot be a part of them.
But how can one admit that nature is part of the discourse? This is the premise of your argument, and I will reject it absolutely.
I do not say that nature is part of discourse, but that it is about nature in the discourse. On the other hand, I see in your position the danger of an objectivism. It is supposed that consciousness is part of a total field, and that the meanings of the speaker are part of the whole of things. Hence the metaphorical character of all your transpositions from the plane of nature to the plane of human meanings.
Yes, but be careful. This is not a metaphor. You speak of metaphor because you start from a conception of meanings that does not integrate the notion of transductive relationship. But here, it cannot be a paralogism in the doctrine I presented because it is not a logism. In other words, there is not a universe of discourse, nor is there a meaning of all meanings. It is quite certain that a doctrine of this kind must present itself as a totality, and that it cannot be thought of with a theory of meaning borrowed from other doctrines. It would then appear as a paralogism, and I do not believe it to be one within its own logic, which it brings with it.
There will be no more metaphorical element in your explanation if you are sure that all the spoken meanings are part of the domain you axiomatize. This is what must first be demonstrated. Now we can only demonstrate it by speaking. We must therefore always presuppose the word and the laws proper to meaning.
No.
No, I was kidding. I can go back from the laws of speech to perception to the insignificant, but I cannot do the opposite process.
No, there's a theory of speech far in excess of what might be admitted. It is giving value to speech. There is a theory of nature in what I've tried to present, which cannot admit such a theory of signification as contained in speech. There is not the word, but there are the words. There is a multitude of types of words. There's the meaning, signification, yes, but not the word.
Right, so we can pause there again at the end of the back and forth with Ricard and Simondon. I think, yeah, this is an interesting back and forth because they start from very different conceptions of what philosophy does, I think, and they end up they sort of just oppose their two conceptions. It's hard for them to sort of find a point of agreement because they start from such different starting points. So Simondon, I think Ricard was right to describe it as he starts from the notion of the human being as integrated into a natural world. There's the realm of human significations is one realm within the world, and then Simondon, Ricard, he starts from the opposite conception that the human being or the human world is opposed to nature. And it constitutes this is a sort of phenomenological conception. The natural world is constituted in language or in the activity of the human subject. So there's a sort of fundamental opposition between their two perspectives, and I don't think there's any way to really make sense of one in the perspective of the other.
Sorry, I kind of missed that. Could you recap? Because I was trying to trace this and I was struggling to follow it a little bit.
Right. Yeah. So the opposition between Ricard and Simondon is, I think, has to do with the relationship between the human realm and the natural world. So for Simondon, the human realm is included within the natural world, or there's a continuity, at least, between the two. Whereas for Ricard, there's the human realm constitutes the natural world within discourse or within language. And so in that sense, they have this fundamental opposition to each other that I don't really think of any way to bridge or to overcome.
What do you guys think of the argument that Ricoeur makes about the speech cannot be part of one of its object sectors? And then he mentions in Stoic language, what is said is not a body. I cannot understand what is said by means of what is said. So I think there he's, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I think Simondon is right to say that the presupposition that Ricoeur is making is precisely that nature is a part of discourse, or it is that nature is included in discourse rather than the opposite. So it's only if you make that presupposition that you can argue that discourse can't be explained on the basis of nature because nature is one of the objects of discourse.
So sorry, go ahead.
So I was going to say that, yeah, I think Simondon states it correctly that Ricoeur was making this presupposition that you would have to either accept or reject.
So is he basically charging him with a kind of like logocentrism or something by saying that like you can only disallow like characterizing this thing that is a paradigm borrowed from thermodynamics as a pure metaphor that's just kind of like linguistic. You can only think that if you think it's almost like that. I'm coming from a very different background here, so bear with me. I'm thinking of like critiques of Said and stuff, where like I love Orientalism as a book and stuff, but like there's these ideas of like, well, how far can you go with this idea of like discourse constituting, or you know that the world is discourse, the world is language, because there's stuff in excess of that isn't captured by it. But I suppose if Ricoeur is coming from that perspective, then it would seem to him that, like he said, you can't explain the word by its own definition. You can't explain language just with another piece of language. But the point for Simondon is that there's a kind of in his ontology, whatever, there's that human speech or discourse or language is not, that there's a realm beyond that. There is a real, so to speak, that if that's the right word, is that right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say so. But here's still this more classical tradition of an opposition between culture and nature in Ricoeur's answer. So I would say he's more looking through this more cultural philosophical lens and the lens of a semiologist of his times, because this stance of a cultural philosophy of this perspective through language, we can explain everything, was very prominent in the 50s, 60s, and ongoing with all these semiologists like Roland Barthes, etc. And I guess Simondon, in this sense, is very much opposing this specific tendency in French philosophy, because he has a very strict ontology that is bound back to the scientific discoveries of his time, and he's building up this bottom to top emergent figures that are not very often yet looked in philosophy, because there is this typical notion of his time that these macro structures of society, of speech, of different forms of episteme or of the logos are structuring all of human existence and experience. And I guess that's why it's so hard to mediate between these two positions right now in this conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of setting out the opposition between the two. And I think going back to Alyosha, your comment, I think maybe instead of saying that Simondon, it has to do, that Simondon puts thought in relation to a real. I think the real is not really a term that Simondon uses, or reality is not so much one of his terms. But I think we can understand this as a kind of naturalism. I think is what this opposition comes down to. So Simondon presupposes that the human realm, or the human domain, or whatever you want to call it, is part of the natural world and arises out of natural phenomena. And so because of that, this paradigmatism, or this borrowing of concepts from the physical realm to apply to the human realm, is valid. And it's not purely metaphorical. It's not just a linguistic transfer. It's looking at actual relations of structuring that are the same in both domains. But if you start from the presupposition that the natural realm is to be understood as the object of discourse, then you reach this sort of impasse where you have the relationship between discourse and the natural world is this sort of fundamental opposition, and you can't explain how discourse arises out of the natural world.
Okay, can I push on this theme a little bit? It seems like there may be the tension that's moving back and forth is around the question of how the translation, first and foremost, before any transduction, poses the philosophical problem. And I think that Simondon may also has tried to analogize and say something about the communicative stratum, the medium between, for example, the study of physics and other biological or the natural sciences, simplified in terms of nature, and then man and the human sciences, simplified in referring to it as utilizing language to talk about the human condition. What I'm trying to say is that there is this problema between the movement from descriptive understanding of the physical phenomenon and how one then analogizes to the human experience, and then how that may be mapped, or how those signals may be communicated back over into the study of natural phenomenon and the gradients that is happening as there is an exchange across these domains. So the influence of the language that is used to understand the natural world, be it physics or chemistry, moving back to try to explain the human condition, and then the use of language to move back through to try to account for the phenomenons that occur in the physical world, seen or unseen. And so I think that this is maybe what it might be under discussion to a certain extent. The loss of the signal, or what's retained. How is the discourse about the natural world affecting man, and vice versa? How is the discourse of man and the use of language able to account for the natural world.
Yeah, I think I'm glad you brought up the notion of communication again, because I think maybe part of what's at issue here is that, as I mentioned earlier, Simondon takes communication to be something secondary. So the communication of information in the information theoretical sense is a secondary phenomenon, and then what he's trying to get at is how how information arises in the first place. So how is a structure generated that can then secondarily be transmitted in the sense of information? So he introduces his notion of a tension of information as something primary rather than the quantity of information that is measured in information theory. And I think part of his opposition to taking language as fundamental is precisely that he understands language as a means of communication primarily, and he's opposing, or he wants to understand what gives rise to what can be communicated rather than the process of communication itself.
Yeah, I think what I got out of the Record's criticism here and Simondon's reply is that I think that Record does bring up a kind of correct accusation that Simondon is particularly weak, possibly with regards to sufficiently delineating the human and natural domain, and this, I mean, it's definitely undeniable that this differentiation is a theoretical precondition for Simondon's project on the mode of existence of technical objects, and especially in the third part, the essence of technicity, which we just went through. But I think that, and of course, okay, and then also I want to say that the Record's approach to bringing up language is a natural reasoning here, because in making the claim to this kind of differentiation, like locating that distinction between when we're referring to human versus nature, it makes sense to kind of, and I guess it's trendy as well to make to look at the natural sciences, particularly the study of natural language that was very, very popular at the time. So it was in either the continental or analytical circles, people were going back to the study of language, and there was this whole linguistic turn around this period. And it does make sense that that if we are to look there, that could be a possible solution to a problem that Simondon could have issue with. But Simondon also, I think he made a very valuable point in the later section, because if you were to theoretically consider language to be a kind of axiomatic consideration of his theory as he posits it, then I think that he risks a kind of reification of the speech level things. And like Simondon would probably say, like, there's a difference in talking about something than there is about talking about that thing. So it's kind of that semantic, meta-semantic difference, which Simondon wants to make sure he's not giving in a first order sense, like a theory of language.
Yeah, this is something that we remarked on in reading that third part of on the mode of existence of technical objects. So for those who weren't there, in that third part, Simondon gives basically a philosophical anthropology, a genesis of a genetic account of different modes of existence of the human being, or of being in the world. He uses the Heideggerian term there. He gives this genetic account of different modes of existence, the magical, the religious, the technical, and so on. But in this whole philosophical anthropology, he doesn't specify where language fits in, or there's no place for language in that whole genetic schema. Yeah, I think we can say that there's probably there's a sort of an absence of language within Simondon's work, and it might be deliberate in the sense that, as you pointed out, 61, that there was this linguistic turn within philosophy, in this era that he is, I guess, setting himself against in that sense. So he's an anti-linguistic philosopher in the sense that language is not a topic that he cares a lot about, or that he puts a lot of importance on. So yeah, that's another sort of locus of this disagreement, is whether we need to make this
So it's a way of behaving that
a place for language within philosophical anthropology.
But couldn't you say that I kind of was asking this in the chat, that like Simondon's critique of what Ricoeur is doing is exactly like, in a way, Ricoeur is doing what he's accusing Simondon of doing, of like, from Simondon's language, of what I was asking non-manifest in chat, of like using the individuated thing to try and explain the individual. So it's like this endless recursive like thing that doesn't actually explain anything. So if you are assuming this divide between man and nature, and then you're trying to start from a point of, it's as though there's like a series of metastable systems that are all resolved into these different states, and then you're using like something that is the end result of something, which is man, as though it is something that needs to be explained. Like, I'm losing the language here, but I guess that it was making me think of that critique that he brings up in this, and I think in other essays, of like, if you're using the distinction and you're assuming the man almost as one kind of individual that needs to be like explained in that way, then it's already assuming a separation from nature. Like there's all kinds of individuation that would have happened throughout that, even that intellectual process, that isn't being acknowledged, right?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think one way of stating the objection that Simondon makes to Ricoeur's mode of arguing is that if you start from the distinction between human and nature, then you're already presupposing what you should be explaining instead. So Simondon wants to go underneath that distinction in some way to show how that distinction arises, rather than starting from the distinction and then remaining within the human realm, or showing how the natural world is constituted within the world of discourse, or something along those lines. So you're already starting from something that is structured with this human nature distinction, rather than showing how the structure arises, which is what he wants to do. Okay, so I think we can go on to the next intervention, or the next back and forth with Jean Hippolyte, I believe. I will now return to what Ricoeur has just said, but I wonder whether you have drawn from the point of view of the axiomatic of the human sciences all that you could have drawn from the theory of information or of game theory. You have especially considered physical science, and you have named axiomatic of the human sciences what is rather a philosophy of nature. You have left aside the discussion of information theory that you had made in your thesis, what it brings that is positive, signal theory, coding, decoding, and what it misses. It measures only a quantity of alternatives and presupposes questions, a meaning that it does not provide. I wonder whether the analysis of what the theory of information brings, what it does not bring, the relation of these signals to an irreducible natural language could not constitute the basis of an authentic axiomatic of the human sciences. Did you prefer a philosophy of nature? It's not a criticism, it's a question.
Without a doubt, only here. If we can appeal to the notion of subception, I would say that I was diverted from analyzing to the end what an information theory could bring, because it seemed to me that it concealed a danger. It conceals the danger of hypostatizing what the Anglo-Saxons call adjustment, adaptation. The theory of information is perfectly suited when the transmitter and the receiver are fixed realities, which is to say, defined once and for all. Their regions of being, their ontological statuses, are defined in advance. To this extent, if one wanted to define a theory of the human sciences based on the theory of information, one would find that the supreme value is to adapt, to adjust. Everything that has been built in this area, all the cybernetic mechanics, all the electronic turtles, electronic foxes, homeostats, are mechanisms of adjustment. And that is precisely what seems to me inapplicable to thinking and researching what man is.
No doubt, but you reduce the theory of information too much to its purely material conditions. The important thing is the notion of randomness. What is communicated in a message is not something, but a series of answers to presupposed questions. There is, nevertheless, in the treatment of information, an effort to structure the probable and the improbable, a remarkable adaptation of mathematics to the human sciences.
But this randomness is ambivalent. There is significant randomness and non-significant randomness. What I am blaming for the probabilistic theory, I'm saying probabilistic, of the information because I would like an information theory but a non-probability theory. What I am blaming for the probabilistic theory of information, it confuses two types of randomness, unpredictability. If, for example, we pour sand on the table to transmit the position of each of the grains of sand, it will be necessary to have a quantity of information which will be greater than that which would be necessary to transmit a page, where would be inscribed the summaries of the most advanced mathematics we know right now. In other words, the arbitrary randomness of the type of the position that the grains of sand take on a table costs as much to transmit in information theory because it is unpredictable as the significant random. Nothing is more difficult to convey than the image of a pile of sand in television, for example.
But then you go no further than I go because you have not engendered meaning. You imagined it with potential intentions. It is rather a metaphor. I believe, for my part, that a reflection on the theory of information should make it possible to explain the difference between meaning and the message.
But how? This is an important problem. It is no longer an information theory that can solve it. For example, if I want to transmit a square, I draw a square on a blank page, I put a television camera on top of the page, and I transmit the square with the line analysis system. It takes 9 million separate points, 9 million separate signals to transmit the square, exactly as if I had to transmit, for example, the granular surface of the table. On the contrary, if I want to convey to a correspondent this, namely, there is a square on this page, it has 9 centimeters of side, and it is equidistant from both edges, with a few words, because my correspondent knows what a square is, I will have done much better than transmitting the television picture.
We agree, we can transmit the word. We are transmitting messages to each other right now, but that presupposes questions, that presupposes meaning. I do not believe that you have solved this problem of meaning by a philosophy of nature, by the potential differences you have mentioned, any more than I can solve it by my reflection on the notion of information. This reflection, however, allows me to avoid these images and delimit exactly the problem. You depart from a philosophy of nature and you bring in the germs of origin, but where did these first germs come from? This is the question.
I will answer this to the first question. I do not believe that a theory of language is opposed to the theory that I presented, because for language to be understood, there must be tension in the receiver. Thus, for example, a language which does not interest, a language which does not bring a message relative to a problem which occupies us, is a dead language, precisely like grains of sand. It is useless, does not inform anything, because it is not the germ which, falling into us on a metastable ground, waiting to be structured, structures it. In other words, there must be an expectation, there must be a need. Here, all the analyses that have been done on the motivations in perception should be presented. As for the second point, namely the origin of structural germs, it is obviously an extremely delicate problem, but I do not believe either that a theory of language can solve it.
But then how can one envisage the relation between all figurative language and natural language?
What would be natural language? Is it still a language?
It's getting too difficult and we've talked too much.
You got that right. I did not look for the origin of archetypal schemes, the origin of forms. Maybe we could.
If you give them, then what? You show us only how they are transmitted and they are amplified.
How they structure a domain without being archetypes that cover the whole, and without being involved in a hylomorphic relationship, that is to say, already immanent in the sunulon, in the individual.
Right, so that's the end of that interaction there. I think Hippolyte's objection is in some ways similar to Ricard's objection. I think he is likewise, he thinks that Simondon needs to start from something like meaning, or that something like meaning is presupposed in what he's doing, and that without having that, without having some sort of theory of meaning prior to trying to do this analysis that Simondon is doing, then you're sort of missing the main part of the problem. So he thinks that we need to have this preliminary theory of meaning before we can do this, what he calls a philosophy of nature.
Yeah, I'm trying to understand why he believed. What is the opposition between figurative and natural language to him? Is this, and maybe I just don't know the genesis of like what 60 was talking about, because it seems to me that the obvious critique of that idea is that even so-called natural language or non-figurative language is still figurative, or that there's no non-abstract language. There's no language that isn't communicated by some kind of performance of like a series of procedures. There's just ones that we're more or less used to based on society, et cetera, et cetera. But like that, it's as though it would be like saying, well, the word boy, it's natural language. It's just a simple concept. It's not like transduction. But I feel like it's uncontroversial, especially like post-structuralist spaces, to point out why that isn't true. Am I going in the right direction, or am I missing the point here?
I would just point you towards like the Chomsky hierarchies. I guess I think that's what they're called, or the Chomsky hierarchy. That where there's an attempt to kind of contextualize the relation between natural language and formal language, because that's like what was really, really theoretically contingent for a lot of projects around this time.
Yeah. So for those who don't know, the Chomsky hierarchy is it's a set of different characterizations of formal languages based on the type of abstract machine that can accept that language. And so Chomsky basically showed or argued that certain types of grammar that were prevalent in linguistics at the time were not actually capable of recognizing certain structures in human languages. So they were too simple, basically, and you need to have a more powerful grammar in order to adequately understand the structure of human languages. I'm not sure, yeah, going back to Hippolyte's intervention, I'm not sure exactly what he means by this opposition between figurative and natural language. I think he's objecting to, he's bringing up this idea that what Simondon was doing is metaphorical in the same way that Picard had done. So the idea that this paradigmatism, it means taking one field as a metaphor for another, or a concept in one field as a metaphor for something in a different field. I guess Hippolyte is objecting to this figurative use of language as being sort of theoretically fundamental. So he thinks that Simondon is treating these metaphors as conceptual elucidations or something like that in an abusive way. Whereas for Simondon, what he's doing is not a metaphor. He's actually finding these same structures in different domains. So there's actual relations. There's this analogical relation is a real relationship between different domains, and it's not a metaphor. And there isn't this sort of presupposed domain of meaning in the way that Hippolyte is arguing.
I'm just trying to understand, like, for example, his earlier objection when he says, I believe that a reflection on the theory of information should make it possible to explain the difference between meaning and the message. Like, could you locate it there as well? Like, there's still a belief or a desire on Hippolyte's part to separate. It's like I think it might just continually go back to this point about transduction that Simondon's always trying to make, of like, on what basis are you assuming these are like two stable entities, the meaning and the messenger, there's the transmitter and the receiver, and they only affect each other insofar as there's in that model, a metaphorical or an imaginary relationship placed between them, but they don't directly sort of like modify or change each other in any way, except for whatever the content of messages or things that are sent back and forth. And the message then is the vehicle for the meaning and all that kind of stuff. Whereas it seems to me, again, I'm literally just making this up because I'm trying to understand, but from reading like some of the forward and some other Simondon stuff, there's a bit where the Gerali, I don't know how you say it, the one who wrote the forward, talks about, he's talking about the idea of the good form as the idea of like the most stable or fixed or whatever, and how Simondon's critiquing that. And then he says that the good form for Simondon isn't that, but it's the one most rich in energetic potential, so charged with future transductions, meaning that information born out of transductive movements isn't already coded or established as a message sent by an emitter, transmitted to a receiver. And then this is the quote I was looking for. It is form-taking topological information. So it's kind of like it informs. I mean, at this point, I'm out of my depth with Simondon, but it just that statement by Hippolyte. I wonder if is it helpful to look at that in terms of him saying like, yeah, how can we characterize the vehicle by which the meaning is transmitted? And this is kind of like a typical structuralist way of looking at language, whereas there's a way that Simondon, I think, is saying that it's like the transductive process itself, where that nothing is lost, and that from the pre-individual state into the individuated state, there's like all these tensions. Just because they are resolved into a new state, it doesn't mean that there's like they've lost their relationship with the previous state. And in fact, it is its internal resonance. I'm not sure the term he uses, but like the tension between these differentials, that it is like always modifying each other, I guess. I'm sure I'll need to know a lot more about Simondon to actually know what I'm talking about here, but.
Yeah, I think that was along the right lines, in the sense that so the comment that Simondon makes about the transmission of signals in television or in photography, I think is a good encapsulation of his criticism of information theory, or what the limits of information theory are. So as he points out in this example, if you pour a bucket of sand on a table and you want to transmit the exact position of each grain of sand on that table, you have to. It takes a huge amount of information to transmit that, even though there's basically no structure to it, or precisely because there is no structure to it. So this transmission has or the message that's to be transmitted has this high quantity of information in the information theoretical sense, but in a more fundamental sense of information, you're not actually transmitting any information because there's no structure to be transmitted. And so he wants to draw from this type of example the notion of a structural information. So this would be like his example of the square, where you can transmit the image of the square just by saying it's a square with these dimensions and so far from the edge of the page and so on. You can just, in a few words, transmit the actual structure of the shape on the page, and so that picture of the square has a high tension of information. In this new concept that he introduces, it has this capacity to generate structure in in a field, the field of the psychological field of the receiver, for example. But even though its quantity of information transmitted might be much lower than the bucket of sand dumped on the table. So he thinks that, so again, this comes down to the idea of communication being secondary. If you treat communication as primary, then you have to recognize this bucket of sand as having this high quantity of information. But if we want to take information in a sense that has more depth to it, and not just in this purely quantitative sense, then we have to make communication secondary to the actual generation of this attention of information.
Yeah, definitely. I really like this idea in this exchange, because he's differentiating these different forms of or different types of information and how they differ from each other. And he's generally reacting to this hypothesis of hyperlight or hyperlight, that there is a difference between meaning and the message conveyed in this theory of information, or the reflection on it. But for Simondon, there is this specific difference, maybe that can be solved with his notion of transduction, that can be then the basis of understanding of human sciences. Because when we look at information theory, there is this problem that it is strictly operational, as you said, in a quantitative sense. So when we transmit something, the different paths it can take, all the channels, all the sender and the receiver, they are all set before we are even beginning to reflect on it in this very static form of information theory, in the theory in the Shannon sense. And I was reminded in this, excuse me, in this paragraph, I was reminded of Michel Serres as well as Jacques Derrida, because both of them have this notion of an more, how can I describe it, of a more dynamic information or communication theory. In Serres it is called the parasite, and in Derrida the différence. So there is always these specific axioms that are set, especially for the channels and the mediums communication has to take, and especially information in a more technical sense, that are not included in this theory of information. They have to be set. They are cuts in the realm of reality that can only be included reflexive in a system through its different interferences, so to speak, and a form and a pure theory of information couldn't allow such a reflexive theory of communication.
Yeah, I think it would be interesting. Like I mentioned, Simondon doesn't really have a theory of language, or doesn't make language into a real thematic for discussion. It would be interesting to see if we could develop this idea of a reflexive communication, or this reflexive dimension to communication that is not analyzed in traditional information theory, and see, because I think some of Simondon's criticism, or his antipathy towards the linguistic turn, or to any sort of approach that takes language as fundamental, I think it's, as we discussed today, I think it to some extent rests on this communicational notion of language, language as having to do with communication, or as being fundamentally structured by communication. And there's reason to question that account of language, I think, and we can, it would be interesting to try to develop these other dimensions of language that don't fit into that communicational account.
Yeah, I just want to add and interject really quickly, because going back to the Chomsky point around the grammars, and I think that Hippolyte was actually siding with the emergence of thought along Chomskyan lines. I do think that Simondon is approaching the question around the communication as secondary, but also from an engineering standpoint, from the physics that is involved with the message, less so than the meaning. With Chomsky grammars, he was saying that natural language has constraints on context-free grammars, and I'm particularly speaking within the domain of language and the languages that are used for computation, so natural language and its various forms of communicating. So I'm kind of ruling out the visual aspect of language, even though that's interpreted by natural languages. I'm talking mainly to the question around the connection between the language as a system that shows mathematical properties and its relation to computation. So Chomsky would talked about the Chomsky grammar, and the BNFs talked about like the recursion aspect, which is seen in mathematics and concatenation, and this has a lot to do with the signal and the message. And the interesting question is around the compositionality, what happens when meaning starts to emerge, and I can only speak to natural language.
So what differently becoming consistent intensive
I would
movements in the
presume that there is a meaning that emerges along the signal, the message. How that is accounted for in these other systems is an interesting question. And I don't know, maybe you guys have been talking to that and I kind of got lost amidst some of the modal information going back and forth between the dialogues and the postings. But I think that there is this thread around the communication, which I too agree. I think Simone is actually pointing to something else initially that I also see is now a big part of some of the AI development around natural language, with nets and weights and how this can generate language and all that. But I won't go off on that right now. I just want to point out that how meaning may be intertwining or flowing on top of the message. What is the means by which that message gets, I hate to use the word cut up or carved up or chunked to create meaning. That's on the very sort of computational level.
Yeah, I think this might be connected to the problem that Hippolyte raises about where these structural germs come from. So on Simondon's account, we have the notion of transduction occurring as the field becomes structured around the structural germ. But Simondon doesn't give an account of where these germs come from in the first place. Yeah, I think it would be interesting to try to develop an account of the formation of these structural germs, because Simondon doesn't want to take this as a sort of chance occurrence. He doesn't want to make chance or probability a fundamental concept. Yeah, I don't know exactly where we can find an origin of these structural germs apart from something like probability or chance. We can go on to the next. There's two short exchanges next. So we have Weinberg and Berger. So do we have a pair of volunteers to do Weinberg and Simondon? If there's no other volunteers, I guess I'll have to be Simondon.
In the strictly constructive part of your presentation, if not even innovative, you spoke of the modular or modulation transductivity without being able to substitute, say, other terms. On the other hand, to pass from the metaphor to a more positive expression of biological or physical order, could this not be translated by the phenomenon of induction? As with viruses, for example, one could speak of dynamic induction, and also to speak of a catalyst element, which, after all, would bring a known term in the place of a new term, perhaps not strictly indispensable.
Yes, the term is insufficient, only it avoids confusion. One can use induction perhaps with this proviso, however. Can induction move forward? This from which there is induction, which creates induction, does it advance? With a theory of induction, one can only ground a theory of the field. But can the origin of the field advance when structuring spreads? Is the source of the inductive field propagating as well? That's what we could ask if we wanted to use the word induction.
In any case, what causes induction is elusive in itself. What can be said is that it is in the very nature of induction to propagate itself step by step. But I grant you the word catalysis, whose property in this case is obviously more questionable.
As for the concept of catalyst, it is not suitable because the catalyst remains foreign to the reaction. It is recoverable. In addition, the catalyst does not propagate through the area where the reaction occurs. On the contrary, transductive fitness is spreading like the explosive wave in a thundering mix. Yeah, I don't know why they chose fitness there. That's a weird choice. So they said, on the contrary, transductive fitness is spreading like the explosive wave in a thundering mix. That should be something like, on the contrary, the transductive form-taking operation propagates like the explosive wave in a thundering mix.
We don't think that the psychosocial is a separate or has different.
Yeah, so I don't know where fitness comes from in there. Just a weird translation choice. Yeah, I'm not sure when Weinberg refers to this phenomenon of dynamic induction and he points to viruses as an example. I'm not sure exactly what he's referring to there. I don't know if anyone else knows what this phenomenon is.
That's beyond my specialty, sadly.
I'm not sure that we don't actually think.
We need to find a virologist to join our group. I can hazard a guess that what he could be referring to is the way that viruses are introduced into a cell and sort of force the cell to produce more viruses. So the initial virus acts as almost like a structuring germ that brings about more virus production. But that would just be a guess that's what he's referring to. I'm not sure. Yeah, Simondon is a little bit wary, I think, of that term induction, possibly because of the meaning of induction in logic or in the intellectual operations. And we did see this on the mode of existence of technical objects, where he did give an account of inductive thinking and deductive thinking and how they arise within the genetic anthropology. And so I think maybe he's wary of using the term induction in this sense because he doesn't want to sort of confuse it with the logical sense of induction.
But I think it must have shown some sort of attribution to induction as used in
We
mathematics.
don't think that the
like in
psychosocial
Taylor
realm is
series.
separate or has different qualities
don't
than the waves
think
and
that
particles exhibit in the way
There,
that they have
that is,
individuation or being or whatever.
a separate metaphoric use of the term induction. I think it's still possibly borrowed from mathematics, and might have to do with proliferation within a cell. But also, yeah, it could be, yeah, I don't know exactly. Maybe there's a physical aspect to this induction. But it has to take in genetic material, the phage of a virus has to take in genetic material in order for its machinery to work. So, when something is induced, and I'm pulling at strings here, but yeah, I don't know exactly.
Yeah, I think we'll just have to leave that point hanging until we can rope in a virologist. We can convince them that studying Simondon is the most important use of their virological talents at the moment. But yeah, we can go on to the last intervention, or the last exchange between Berger and Simondon. If I can get two volunteers.
Just one point on this induction. I was kind of reminded of Peirce here, because when he speaks here of induction and criticizes it, so Simondon, there is this question if induction creates something or reproduces this genetic aspects, or if it is the source of the inductive field propagating as well. So in Peirce there are also these forms of mathematical syllogism of deduction, induction, and abduction. But for Peirce, induction is like the deduction, something that doesn't create something new in particular. So as for viruses, for example, we have a specific threshold we have to reach for an infection to happen, for example. But there's not something particularly new created in this sense. There's also this determination of new qualitative aspects that can be reduced to the qualitative aspect in induction. But for Peirce in abduction, there's a new form of thinking these processes, because there's the element of something new that is happening, these specific jumps that cannot be reduced to a mere probability or to a quantitative element that has to be reached. So there's already this productive, this in a very idealistic sense, this poietic element that creates a new qualitative aspect inside of a system or a process that can then initiate new steps in the evolution of a specific system in relation to its surroundings, or to in the relation to other systems or subsystems.
Yeah, I've often wondered whether Simondon knew Peirce, or knew Peirce's work. I mean, yeah, because of this triad of the deduction, induction, and abduction, and I've wondered how the notion of transduction fits in with those three forms of reasoning in Peirce. But yeah, I don't recall ever seeing any reference to Peirce directly in Simondon. But yeah, it's an interesting comparison to make.
Yeah, I like the whole history of abduction is really interesting, and kind of the syllogistic interchanging model that Peirce uses for his formalization of abduction is very similar to stuff that is within the deep history of philosophy. For example, you can see kind of the interchanging of the syllogisms in Phenomenology of Spirit in the Hegel work. So it's there's a long kind of history of what Peirce ultimately kind of formalized as the abductive relation.
Yeah, actually, I thought you were gonna, when you mentioned Hegel, I thought you were gonna talk about the science of logic and the role of the syllogism and the different the sort of rotation of the syllogism in the science of logic. But
yeah, right. But I wanted to point at the phenomenology, because he does mention the interchanging of syllogisms in the phenomenology also. And whenever I talk about science of logic, people get scared. So.
Yeah, it's intimidating. But yeah, so we can try to finish the reading with the last exchange here, so we can get 2 volunteers to read this exchange.
Sure, I can do Berger.
Wants to be Simondon.
I could do Simondon.
I would like to ask a question. Where do you put consciousness? Should we assume it at the beginning?
It is very difficult to answer. Consciousness, in the very sense of the word, is not supposed at first as a clear consciousness, but there are analogs of consciousness staggered on several levels, and consciousness integrates the patterns of activity of these less perfect analogs. There's a function of consciousness which is precisely the application of forms to contents by artifices that make it possible to structure a domain of mutually incompatible elements without discovering a new dimension.
I understand what in your demonstration makes one think of the consciousness, but consciousness seems to be much more than that. Consciousness is effort, experience, feeling. I use metaphors too, but how to operate differently. When you say that the information is transmitted, that there is more or less information, that the information is rich or poor, I translate this into valid terms for the subject. It means that the information does not appear only when a consciousness receives a message and can give it meaning. It is by bringing into consciousness that it might be possible to resolve the difficulty presented by Mr. Hippolyte and Mr. Ricoeur. If therefore you stay in the field of object analysis, your theory as a description of the object is, it seems to me, a very great truth, but I can use it only if there is information for the subject. And if there is no information, that is, an awareness of something, then all the rest loses its interest. Because what is a field? I can explain a field by the test I'm doing, by the consciousness, it's a certain meaning. If on the contrary you speak of a purely objective field, without an act by which I become aware of a meaning, then it is a metaphor. There is something in your system that deserves to be defined. I do not ask a particular question, but I mention this problem to know if your system is in objectivism. I do not say that at all to diminish its interest. On the contrary, I think it is very frank, very clear, and very helpful. But is it an objectivism that would bring out a more complicated form than the others, a new reality that you will call consciousness?
It is not an objectivism. The system would like to be a transobjectivism. That is to say, a theory according to which the theory that we have of the object is a subjective representation of the object. We make of the object a poor and negative idea. It is what is not the subject, a residue of the knowledge that the subject has. In fact, the true real is not objective. It must be grasped beyond this reductive notion. Before any opposition of subject and object can exist, a mode of being prior to the mode of the subject and the mode of the object. The shaping operation would belong precisely to this mode of being. According to this perspective, consciousness should not be considered through an adversarial scheme of all or nothing, subject or object, but rather from a more primitive transconsciousness. Also, I do not think I can maintain the opposing dualism between subject and object, but on the contrary, must consider it as expressing the result of a process of taking shape, which is, in this case, the process of individuation. It is the word ontogenesis that summarizes the question.
We will adjourn the meeting by thanking Mr. Simondon for all the reflections he has given us, as well as the people who participated in the discussion made it particularly lively. And thank you all too today for making the discussion very lively.
Yeah, it was nice. I think maybe before we leave, though, there's a couple points to discuss in this last exchange, because I think the last answer where he says it's not an objectivism, it's a transobjectivism. I think that's a good summary of what he's trying to do. Is he wants to give an account of the arising of the distinction between subject and object, rather than starting from the subject and showing how the subject constitutes an object or something along those lines, like a traditional phenomenological account. So this is definitely connected to that discussion about how the human domain fits into nature that we were talking about earlier in connection with Louis Caron's intervention. So I think this last response from Simondon is a very clear explanation of what he's trying to do.
Yeah, I think Berger probably didn't really, his questioning was more, I mean, in some sense, of course, it's going to be the question of in philosophy of mind, like where is the seat of consciousness? What is your philosophy of mind is kind of what's being asked there, but it's less a potentially problematic question, I think, than the ones that Ricoeur and Hippolyte posed earlier, which is that this not an accusation of an objectivism, which is clearly something which he's avoiding with his kind of ontogenetic claims, but a kind of accusation of a certain lack of distinction about the subjective constitution of the object. And I think that there is, I mean, ultimately, I think that whether this will be, whether you're convinced or not, we'll have to kind of wait for the next episode, which is this wonderful book that we're going to start next time.
Yeah, that's a good segue to. I was going to sort of preview a little bit of what we're going to see in the book. I haven't actually read the foreword, which is new to the English edition, so I'm not sure how long it is. I didn't look at the scans yet, but do we want to read the foreword first? I find sometimes the foreword or preface or whatever is almost presupposes having read the book, so it's not always that helpful to read it first, but I guess we can decide collectively what we want to do.
I wouldn't mind. Put me down for a 4 if it's a binary decision.
Yeah, I'd be interested in doing it. I think it's very dense, but I found it somewhat helpful. So
I'm for the forward.
Okay, so it sounds like everyone pretty much, I'm not hearing any objections. So yeah, it sounds like we're in favor of reading the foreword. So that would be new to me. But in addition to that, so how many pages actually is the foreword? We can decide how much we want to read for next time if people want to read in advance.